Welcome back to the Art of Fundraising. This is Paul Sheldon, and we're reviewing the sequence that we've been through with the 7 questions as an introduction to the art of fundraising. This week, we've reviewed in some detail this cascading sequence of questions that organizes a conversation. As that conversation emerges, you're listening for 3 to 5 key individuals who will be your major donors, your major supporters, your centers of influence. And each time you meet with someone, it goes without saying that you're going to ask for referrals. You're going to master the question, is there anybody else we should be talking with that we might not have thought of? And would you be willing to act as our intermediary to reach them? Oftentimes people will respond to that question with, let me think about that a little bit. And there are several ways to respond to that. One, of course, is to say, okay, I'll sit here for a few minutes while you think of people. That's the assertive approach. I like that response because it's an opportunity to schedule a follow-up conversation. And it really does give people an opportunity to dream up what they would like to share with you and how they would like to support what you're doing. We talked about how not to ask for money. When we said, you can just broach the subject by saying, I was thinking of you for a contribution or an investment or a loan guarantee of a certain amount. How does that feel to you? Or you can say, if you were asked today, how would you feel about making an investment? Or in the template for the 7 questions we have, if we asked you for a contribution, would you make one and at what level? Or would you consider making a gift? And we talked in some detail yesterday about what if it doesn't feel right to you? What if you just aren't comfortable asking this person to make a contribution yet? Let it go. It's okay to cultivate the relationship or to pass to someone else who's more comfortable discussing a potential contribution. Today, I wanted to talk about what else is there besides fundraising. This fundraising is great, but what are you raising money for? We haven't really talked about that. And so I'm going to skate across the surface of your homework from session 3, which is how to understand and realize dreams, the 3 conversations of effective dream streams. And I need to define a couple of terms here, which are in the attachment that we posted in the LinkedIn group. One is dream flow, the idea that you're flowing towards the realization of a dream. And another is the analogy or metaphor of dream streams, where everyone who contributes to your realization of the dream or to the shared realization of the dream is like a tributary to the dream stream that's flowing towards the realization of the dream. So sometimes we talk about them as contributors or tributaries. And there are lots of ways to describe those people: donors, sustainers, supporters. The language doesn't matter, but in the next few minutes here, I'm going to use the term contributor or tributary. When we constitute a dream stream, and once again, this is the word that I prefer to use instead of team, because I don't think that life is a game, and I don't think that there are winners and losers. I think there's a flow of life, and so it's just a metaphoric preference. But when we're talking about a specific topic like fundraising, it's very useful to have specifically defined terms. For example, if you went to the dentist and the dentist said to their assistant, give me that thingamajig over there, I wouldn't feel like a sense of confidence about whether that dentist knows what they're talking about. If they say, give me a number 5 burr, I'd be worried because they're going to be using a burr on my tooth, but at least I know they know what they're talking about. So in our consideration of the development of a fundraising sequence, I'm going to use dream streams as a way to describe the process of realizing dreams. This approach comes out of a tradition of work in which there are certain kinds of speech, technical term is performatives, but they become speech acts. By saying something, you create a future. When you have a declaration of peace and people say, we're not going to fight anymore. We're going to lay down our weapons and talk. That's a declaration that creates a possible future. If a doctor says, well, the tests show you're cancer-free, you're done, that creates a different future. If someone says, I now pronounce you husband and wife, or wife and wife, or husband and husband, or married, that's a declaration that creates a future. So these conversations are what we call non-discretionary conversations. What I mean by that is, if you don't have these conversations, they will come up later. And they don't all relate to fundraising per se, but I just wanted to share with you a taste of what else can be done, because next week I'm going to be offering each of you an opportunity to proceed further with your expression of the art of fundraising. And this will be one of the things that we'll talk about that we could be doing. So each of these three conversations is a topic that can be unpacked into basic agreements and commitments that produce coordination and standards for DreamStream participation. And effective DreamStreams coordinate around these committed agreements in three particular areas. What's the dream? This is mission, vision, values. This is, what are we up to here? Are we building a building? Are we building a boat? Are we taking a hike? Are we serving a particular constituency? The more specific you can be, the more likely you'll be to be able to realize a dream. The second conversation is, who am I? This is the roles and responsibilities question and the power and authority question. Who am I, and who are you? Who gets to speak on behalf of this DreamStream? Who says, I'm representing this DreamStream of Golden Rule reentry, or this animal shelter, or this campus that's dedicated to this purpose? And who gets to sign checks? Who gets to borrow money? These are the who am I conversations. And then, how am I feeling? And this is an area that many organizations and projects forget about. They just kind of feel like, oh, we'll deal with it when it comes up. And this gets into the area of moods. What is the mood of this undertaking? Do we have a dance group that's preparing for a performance? And are we all feeling celebratory about being able to share what we have to perform? Or are we distracted by the logistics and people are getting mad and they're bickering with each other? The feeling of your enterprise matters, and each person's mood matters. So with regard to what's the dream, this is, what's the shared vision? What are the aspirations, the mission, the values of the DreamStream? And these pervade the background of your engaging in the 7 questions. You don't have to talk about all of this background stuff. People can feel it. Are you certain about what's going on here? And so each of these can be unpacked as conversations, but basically, what are you dreaming of? Where are you going? What do you really care about in this project or undertaking that you're engaged with? And what are the standards that you use for flowing together towards shared dreams? So the format that I'm sharing with you today is called a developmental quiz. It's a check-in session. It's an assessment for you to assess, where are we in the process of realizing this dream? Because if you have all these conversations in place, you've talked about what your basic standards are and the other things that we're going to get to in a minute, then you won't fall in that hole for not having held that conversation with the people who are engaged in your DreamStream. So, for example, does every contributor own the shared DreamStream and mission and promises together? Are you building a football stadium? Are you cultivating a garden? Has everybody agreed that you're only growing native plants in your pollinator garden? Or has everyone agreed on the layout for what kinds of vegetables are going to be grown in what areas of the garden, whether or not you're using pesticides, what kinds of compost you're stirring into the soil? These are conversations that you can have that allow people to commit to the statement of, this is our shared DreamStream for where we're going in the future. And it can be a promise or an agreement or a declaration or just a kind of a group meeting where everybody goes, uh-huh. It depends on the nature of the project, but it's really important that everybody has owned the promise of the DreamStream, making honest assessments and declaring diversions. And we'll talk about diversions in a minute. Have you established the standards of assessment? So you have to develop or adopt shared standards, otherwise differing behavior and miscoordination and turbulence in the flow of the DreamStream and unresolved disagreement will happen. And these standards can be verbal, they can be written, they can be a wonderful statement of aspirations that goes up on the wall, any level, whatever works for you. But has each tributary, each participant in this DreamStream accepted and agreed to the shared standards of assessment? That makes a difference when you get into diversions. Have you established procedures and schedules for planning? Do you have a monthly or a quarterly or an annual session where you discuss your plan and you agree on a shared plan for how and what you're going to do? What are your procedures and practices to ensure that you have effective planning? Have you established procedures and practices for ongoing learning, for considering the possibility of mid-course correction or disruptive innovations? And what are your procedures and practices for that effective learning? How do you engage these questions? These are all non-discretionary conversations that if you don't have them, they'll come up on their own. And have you established procedures and practices to support innovation? Are you open to possibility? One of my favorite examples in the 20th century is Eastman Kodak, that was deeply committed to printing photographs on paper. Does anybody know where Eastman Kodak is now? They don't exist anymore. They went out of business because they weren't open to procedures and practices for innovation. And lastly, how do you encourage and support diverse points of view and identities that lead to disruptive but beneficial innovations? And this is the topic of diversions, which we haven't talked about much this week, and it could be a whole universe unto itself. But as you're flowing towards the realization of the dream, events occur, conversations happen, people show up that divert you from what feels like the flow towards realization of the dream. And so have you developed procedures and you encourage diverse points of view? Is it okay for somebody to say, hey, wait a minute, I'm not comfortable with the direction that we're going? And then integrate that, welcome that dissent, and channel it into beneficial innovations or not. And that's where your power and authority conversation comes in that we'll get to in a minute about who has the role of saying that's not germane to the conversation we're having. That's where Robert's Rules of Order came from, is how does an assembly of people declare a purpose and make decisions and declare actions for the future? Are you keeping a view toward the future of the organization, this DreamStream and the DreamStream tributaries? Because each of us is living a life, we're walking our own career path. If you're starting an organization and you're hiring people, or you're starting a new aspect and you're hiring people, it's important to engage them in what are their goals and dreams for the future about their own lives, not intruding into their personal lives necessarily, but finding out, what are you here for? Some people are here for a job. They want to show up on time, follow instructions, and go home. Some people are participating like owners of the DreamStream. And there's a place for all of that as the organization or the project grows. So I'm going to slow down here a minute to just allow you an opportunity to comment before we go into who am I. How's this sitting with you? What does it bring up for you as you think about raising money going forward? David?
I think that the key there is in diversions. And so the core of that question is having a process, how to work with new even objections or different ideas. And if it's fundamentally, I don't want to do that, or the leadership says no, that's not good. But you have to have a good process rather than shutting somebody down. So that's the point.
Yes, that's one of the points, is to make sure that as you start into raising money, that all the people who are participating with you are on the same page. Everybody agrees on what is it that we're raising money for. I'm going to a meeting tomorrow at Peace House for the new Ashland Sviatokirsk Sister City program. Sviatokirsk is in the eastern Ukraine, in the Donetsk region that's so contentious. And what we're doing to declare that we're sister cities matters. But if some people say, well, I don't think we should be raising money to send to the Ukraine, we have 18 Ukrainian families here in the Rogue River Valley, we should be giving money to them. That's a conversation that we have to be able to integrate in some way. And we have to have our roles and responsibilities clear. If somebody says, oh, you have beetles in the garden, you need to use this pesticide, that means the organic garden isn't going to be an organic garden anymore if it's a chemical pesticide. And so those kinds of diversions are part of the question, what's the dream? And we have to have an opportunity. Well, we don't have to. We will have an opportunity to engage with dissent. One of my favorite examples is one of our Dream ambassadors who trained our peer facilitators in the prisons in Ohio and Missouri was staying at the same house that I was staying in St. Louis a few years ago. And we were having a discussion about a particularly controversial topic. And she leaned forward and she said, I couldn't possibly disagree with you more. And that opened up a wonderful conversation where I had to admit that I was wrong and she was right, which is always a fun conversation to have between a man and a woman. For the man to say, oh, I was wrong, you were right, is a rare phenomenon. But that's another topic. So that's an essential element, but it's subsidiary to the question, what's the dream? What are we up to here? What are our mission, vision, values? What's our plan? Do we have a plan? And this is one of the things that can come out of the 7 questions. It's fine to start into the 7 questions without a plan. You can say that honestly and say that we're planning on a phased approach here. Phase 1 is to create the plan. If we held a meeting to talk about what our plans are, would you come? You don't have to have everything preformed, but you have to get there eventually, because otherwise you end up with a pot of money and bickering and arguments over where you're going to spend the money or no money.
That's where I see I'm at, because beginning this thing, like, I don't even know how to start a nonprofit.
Yes.
So I've got to ask some questions of people and get some people that are resourceful in that area that can help me, do that. And then I've got to ask for somebody to help me run it, before I even think about money. Yeah.
And that's a question that I get asked a lot. Should we be a nonprofit? Should we be a for-profit? Should we be a co-op? Should we be a benefit corporation? Should we be a fraternal association? Are we going to engage in lobbying? Can we engage in lobbying? What about candidates? These are all questions that are, once again, non-discretionary. If you don't engage in them in advance, then they'll come up. How do we apply for a 501c3 status with the IRS? And lawyers charge $6,000 for that, to answer that question. And volunteers can do it, but they can also get distracted and not do it. So these are all prerequisite questions. And that's, everybody's at some point along that process. Other comments, thoughts, wonderments?
I just appreciate the mindfulness of all of this. I think it's important to be mindful about all of these things, money and trajectories and things like that. So I just appreciate that element rather than it just be setting the goal and here's the technique to reach the goal.
Thank you, Abigail. Yeah. Yeah, because back on that cycle of the seas, the careful intention is a very important watershed moment. When you declare your intention, if you don't mind my using you as an example, you have to answer the question, are we dealing only with people who are formerly incarcerated? What if somebody walks in the door who's unsheltered and they're not formerly incarcerated? Do we offer them assistance? And if we have assistance for finding housing for people who are formerly incarcerated, do we withhold that from people who aren't formerly incarcerated? These are questions that if you ask in advance and have your answers clear, then you can define the dream stream. And Sean has a wonderful photo in place of his smiling face of a river. And rivers have low flow channels and they have high flow channels and they have floodplains that define the valley. So as you clarify what's the dream, what are our standards, who's participating, and these other conversations we're going to talk about today, that creates your low flow channel. We're hearing a lot of conversation nationally, I think in part inspired by Cassidy Hutchinson, who uses the phrase guardrails. Are there any guardrails? And John Denver used to recite this wonderful poem called The Ambulance Down in the Valley, about a town that was deriving revenue from a mountain road where people would drive off and on the road and end up down in the valley, and they had an ambulance that would go out and pick people up. And that provided revenue to the town. And somebody said, well, why don't you just put a barrier up on the highway and then people won't end up down in the valley? Oh no, we couldn't do that. We'd lose all our revenue. Wonderful analogy for the way many systems are set up these days. If people plant a garden and grow their own vegetables, that negatively impacts the way we measure gross national product. If people get healthy and don't need hospital care, that negatively impacts the way we define success economically, the way our culture is currently structured. And Robert Kennedy in the 1960s gave a wonderful speech about that we maybe need to look at how we define success. And even the Kingdom of Bhutan has invested in a gross national happiness index. And France tried to mimic that, where we look at not just the economy, but are people satisfied? Are they healthy? So there's lots of things that we can include as we start out that save us from having the water spill out across the valley and erode things rather than nourishing our fields.
Hi, Paul. This is Jerry. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Well, I think you've just described our healthcare delivery system as one where we've removed the guardrails, and
Yeah.
the system is benefiting off the ill health of the people and those who are growing good food and interfering with the gross national product towards happiness.
Yeah, and we've defined health as the absence of treatable disease. and we don't look at diet, exercise, companionship, right livelihood, all the noble truths of the Buddhist traditions, because we very narrowly defined, quote, healthcare as treating disease using drugs and chemicals and surgery and Western allopathic medicine. And now we're paying the consequence of that with a national system that is defined in that direction and excludes people who want to grow a garden and go for a walk with a dog in the morning and are more interested in being healthy than treating their illness. So these are all questions that fit into this. What's the dream?
So for me, I think you've really hit it on the head with this session in terms of areas where I'm experiencing or feeling stuckness. And that is when you open the gate, you want to know that your team is there, aligned, and ready to move forward. And
Yes.
what I've noticed with our operation is that, and I don't want to make an excuse, but I've observed a difference in employee relationships following COVID, post-COVID, as pre-COVID. And in pre-COVID, it seemed that we had longer lasting relationships with our employees, less turnaround. And some of our employees were there for 5, 10, even 15 years. And right now, what I'm witnessing, and I guess we're calling it certain certain terms like early quitters and this sort of thing, where I'm seeing 3 or 6 month turnarounds. And so there really is a difference now. What I'm also
Yeah.
observing is the relationship with tenants. We probably have 60 different units on site, and some are there just to live peacefully and close the door, have a place to sleep, and not really wanting to engage. So in building a non-intentional community of 60 diverse points of view or realities, and to try to make a intentional community, move towards an intentional community, and get out of the role of tenants and landlords in terms of, well, let's share a common vision and dream. That is a difficult obstacle. So in opening the door and leaving the shoot, I don't have this sense now, less now than pre-COVID, that we're really engaged and on the same page.
Yeah, and that's not unique to you. That's in the culture. So let's talk about this question, who am I? This is the roles and responsibility question, where each contributor fulfills an agreed upon role in the DreamStream's pattern of promises and responsibilities. So are we a hotel? Are we a farm? Are we a community? Are we an animal rescue operation? Are we a service for formerly incarcerated people? When we've defined what the dream is, then each contributor gets to have a role. They might be a customer who comes in and orders t-shirts to be screen printed, but they may be a co-creator who comes in to participate as a maker, or someone who wants to contribute to the organization overall. Are we clear about who promises what to whom in this dream stream? Who's the spokesperson for the dream? And you see this on grand scales when the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints started out with Joseph Smith as the prophet. And then people started popping up saying, I've had an inspiration from God. I've had an inspiration from God. I have a commandment from God. This is what we should do. And lo and behold, about that time, Joseph Smith got an inspiration from God that said, you're the only prophet. Nobody else speaks for God. Well, that was a defining moment in the history of the church. And now, almost 200 years later, they have 12 million members worldwide and only one prophet. And every organization has to do that. At Planting Justice, we had founders who started the organization, and they were the ones in authority. And then they realized, hey, we'd like a more diverse leadership. And so they named a co-director who is from a very different background from the founder, who speaks in a very different way with a very different perspective, and they share authority. And so there are many, many models. The Romans had triumvirates, where they would have 3 people in charge who had to come together to make important decisions. In the United States, our founding fathers in their wisdom said, nope, one president who speaks for the nation, but the Congress has control of the money. And the judiciary has control over the interpretation of the Constitution. And so they created checks and balances. Everybody gets to declare what are the roles and who promises what to whom in our dream stream and on behalf of the dream stream. And once again, as David was noting, this becomes particularly relevant when diversions happen. When somebody pops up and says, I'm in charge here. And to pick on Planting Justice again, they got I think a $1.2 million grant from Alameda County a few years ago to do work that involved going into San Quentin State Prison and teaching classes there about food justice and gardening and similar topics. And about halfway through the project, one of the collaborators, one of the other organizations that was helping to deliver these services, popped up and said, I'm in charge now. This one person said, I'm making the decisions now. I'm deserving and I'm qualified. I'm going to be the director of this project. And Planting Justice got to say, no, you're not. We are. And they had to go back to the funder and clarify the roles and look at the original proposal and say, yep, sure enough, Planting Justice is the voice of authority here. The director of Planting Justice gets to make the decisions. But because they had that determined in advance, they were able to deal with the diversion relatively effectively. The one person ended up leaving, and that organization didn't cooperate anymore, but the program went forward, and they were able to deliver the services because they had clarified what the roles were. And when somebody pops up and says, I'm changing it, I'm going to have a different role now, if you're clear about who promises what to whom in your DreamStream, you can handle that more efficiently than if then it becomes a personality conflict and people arguing and yelling at each other in meetings. Also, do we coordinate action between contributors for the sake of the shared mission? And how? Who gets to say, we're going to do this part and you're going to do that part? When I served as the coordinator for the Humboldt Folklife Festival in Arcata 30 years ago, we had 15 people on a coordinating committee. And we had some people dealing with trash and recycling, and some people dealing with musicians, and some people dealing with the sound systems, and other people dealing with food. And we met once a month and coordinated everything. As the coordinator, I didn't do much. I arranged for the parade permit and the insurance. And other people did everything that happened for a festival for 5,000 people. I'm sure Dr. Jerry has had similar experiences with festivals at the Wellsprings, where you have effective coordinating groups who've shared who's going to do what, and they coordinate their actions for the sake of the shared mission and promises, and it goes smoothly. And anybody who's organized events probably has had the opposite, where you don't get that clear in advance and it ends up with bicker fests. So this is an important part of who am I? And does each participant aspire and act to satisfy the beneficiaries of the DreamStream's promises? Who are we doing this for? Are we acting in a way that is trauma informed? Golden Rule is a wonderful example of making sure that we understand that anybody who's been to prison and has come out of prison has been traumatized. And they were probably acting out of trauma when they did whatever they did that got them sent to prison. And so everyone at Golden Rule Reentry is required to go through training to understand this notion of trauma, and that hurt people, and that when somebody's acting out, it makes a difference whether we listen from a perspective of understanding trauma. And then those people who've been trained are then authorized to act and satisfy the beneficiaries, to make sure that somebody gets a ride, that they get to court on time, that they're fed, that they have a place to live, and all the things that we do for each other. And in the essential day-to-day conversations towards the realization of a shared dream, does each participant commit to honor, respect, and maintain the pattern of authority? Do they know who's in charge here? Or do they just run off representing this project or this organization to the press and saying, I'm a spokesperson for? Have they actually had an opportunity to make political declarations about, yes, so-and-so is in charge here, so-and-so is the spokesperson, we don't have anybody in charge, we make all our decisions together by consensus? However the group organizes it, if you get that square in advance, then that who am I conversation doesn't come up later on as a diversion. And does everyone know who gets to have which conversation in terms of making decisions, choices, assessments, requests, promises? Who can sign on behalf of the organization? At Golden Rule Reentry, we're negotiating for a piece of property that may become a recovery transition home for formerly incarcerated people. And the real estate agent asked me yesterday, well, who's going to sign the offer if you submit an offer to buy this property? Really important question to know the answer to. I was able to say without hesitation, Abigail. But if you don't know that, if you don't know who can sign an advertising agreement or open a bank account or sign a check, that's going to be a diversion later on. So it's important that everybody knows who has what power and authority and how it works. And then how do you maintain clarity and consistency with regard to granting, using, and organizing power? What if somebody says, I don't like them, I don't want to work with them, and that's the person who has power and authority? How do we deal with that? How do you maintain clarity and consistency with regard to who's in charge and what their job description is? One of my mentors 40 years ago was the city manager of the city of Sierra Madre. And he loved it when somebody would come into his office and say, well, that's not in my job description. because he would call out to his assistant and say, Pamela, could you please bring John's personnel file in here? I need to make a change to his job description. But maintaining that consistency is really important as you move forward beyond raising money to spending the money and doing something that you planned to do. So once again, I'm going to pause for a moment so we can talk about what's the dream and who am I before we get into how do I feel. How is this impacting you? What is it provoking in you?
For me, it's saying, oh my gosh, I need way more policies.
Yes. Yeah. Do you have a harassment policy? Do you have a conflict resolution policy? Have you adopted some examples from another organization or project so that when somebody comes up and says, you're a racist, you have a policy for how to deal with that? If somebody says, what you just misgendered me and I feel like this is a hostile work environment, what do you do? Do you have a conflict resolution group? David?
It also seems that a lot of this depends upon the original structure, organizational structure that you choose.
Yeah. And so this goes beyond the art of fundraising to what are we raising money for and how are we going to organize and manage ourselves if we're successful. I've seen organizations get $1 million dropped on them and fall apart because they hadn't had these conversations and they couldn't accommodate the opportunity that was dropped in their laps. And
I think that's a really important point, Paul, because also, you know, it's the energy that you're greeting people with. It's a subtle thing. It's not a material, tangible thing, but there's a confidence and there's an energy that comes out of an organization that's, excuse my language, but it's got its shit together, you know?
Yeah. And what was that wonderful phrase you had the other day? A friendly face, a safe place?
Yeah, friendly face, safe space. Yeah.
And that defines who's in charge and how we do what we do. And we're going to talk about that more in a minute when we talk about how am I feeling. But having that shared aspect of the mission that we're a friendly face and a safe space defines how people are. It's not just business as usual. It's not just transaction. It's not just fill out this form and go sit over there. But part of the mission is to be welcoming, to say, hi, glad you're here. Do you want something to drink? Do you need to use the bathroom? To create a sense of welcome. And this is the whole domain of customer service that has become an oxymoron. You know, the phrase customer and service don't occur in the same sentence anymore because people are so busy following the rules that they don't remember that it's about serving someone and satisfying someone through keeping a promise to them to be a car wash. Many decades ago, I discovered that washing cars had gone from getting a car clean to running a car through a machine. And when it came out the other side, if the bottom half of the side panels of the car were still covered by mud, it wasn't part of the mission of the organization to get the car clean. Their mission was to run the car through the car wash. And it didn't matter whether the car got clean or not. Now that's kind of gotten better in the last few years, but and we won't get into the socioeconomic oppression of having car washes and making people work in car washes to begin with. But this whole notion of what's our shared promise? What have we promised our customers or our donors or our clients or our participants or the people who are sharing in the flow of this dream stream? And does everybody share that promise in multiple ways? Other comments before I dive into how am I feeling?
Hey, Paul. Yeah, to me, what comes up is just like the need for mentorship and the importance of consulting people who've gone before you. You know, if I walk out into the forest and I don't know the trail, how to get up to the top of the hill, but somebody who's been there can come down and advise, you know, all the pitfalls along the way. I think it's really hard to, in the beginning at least, to know all the pitfalls because you haven't sort of fallen in, but the importance of actually having support and mentorship.
Thanks, Sean. So I'm going to motor on through here because we're almost done. And that is, how am I feeling? How do I maintain a mood for success in fulfilling the DreamStream's mission and dream flow? Have the participants learned to recognize, manage, provoke, and intervene in moods? Do we have a ritual, a ceremony, a procedure for greeting ourselves, for listening to and attending to what am I contributing to this dream stream as a feeling? And I'm always disturbed by the best analogy of this that I've ever heard, because it's the potluck. Your mood is part of what you bring to the potluck. And if you've made gluten-free hand-rolled sushi rolls and you have them beautifully displayed on a plate with flowers and you bring them in with a smile and everybody goes, "Oh, wow, gluten-free sushi, this is wonderful." That's a contribution to the mood. Conversely, some people come in with a secret paper bag and drop dog turds in the punch bowl. That's their grumpy mood, their mood of resentment or of victimization. And so it's really important to understand that moods are a predisposition to action. They're not just a private affair. A dream stream in a mood of resignation or resentment is not going to be able to perform with excellence. And a dream stream in a mood of aspiration and success has a much greater likelihood of realizing the dream for the future. Cliff Bar and Company has dispensed with goals. They don't have goals anymore. They have aspirations, and they support each other in reaching for the aspirations, because that's the culture they want, is a culture of aspiration in their organization. And by doing that, they've acknowledged sometimes you fall down. They use mountain biking and mountain climbing as their corporate metaphors. And so sometimes you get a flat tire. Sometimes things happen. And so how do you manage and anticipate diversions as part of the DreamStream excellence? Do you invite and give each DreamStream contributor permission to declare diversions and ask for time and attention and resources to address them appropriately? And this, of course, allows for the possibility that a diversion might be a useful innovation. It might be one of those disruptive innovations like, hey, maybe we shouldn't be printing photographs on paper anymore, or maybe we should enhance our offerings to do digital photography. And if the powers that be say, nope, that's not our mission, well, that's a decision. But such decisions have consequences. And is dissent welcomed when contributed in respectful and harmonious ways? Is it okay for people to say, well, you know what? Grammar and spelling are oppressive tools of the colonial society, and marking people down for not having proper grammar and spelling is an oppression. Is there space for that conversation? And do you have ways of keeping guardrails and channels on those conversations so that you don't get diverted into the dissent conversation and forget about your mission? And even when dissent seems disruptive, do you give consideration to the role of creative discontent as possibly leading to useful innovation within the limits of safety and overall dream flow? Do you welcome the dissenters and say, well, thank you for speaking up. I hadn't thought about that. I'm going to need to reflect on that. Can we schedule another time to explore that? Even when you say your initial reaction is, oh my God, here we go again. Do you make a place for that to happen? Because that's one of the things that keeps people around. There's an old axiom that people won't remember what you say, they'll remember how you make them feel. And that's very much true of employees and volunteers. Do we provide a place where employees and volunteers can speak up and feel welcomed and safe when they do? And how do you evoke and produce trust together? How do you make a trust a context within which your DreamStream contributors invest attention and learn to produce, resolve, and recover And when that trust is lost, when somebody doesn't show up on time or they didn't keep a promise, what procedures and practices do you have for restoring trust? Are your standards clear and your measurements clear so that when somebody is unable to do what they said they will do, you can talk about it in a kind, compassionate, and supportive way so that people feel like we've been given an opportunity to grow rather than that they've been reprimanded or ostracized or excluded in some way. So we've danced across the surface of this, and I'll be in touch with all of you to talk about next steps. Like, what do we do now that we have some idea of the art of fundraising, and hopefully the whole process of cultivating relationships with people with an eye towards raising money has become a little less mysterious and a little more comfortable for you. We've created this LinkedIn group specifically so that you can talk about this stuff online. And I think you all have various emails for me. So what does this provoke in you? How do you sit with these 3 conversations to constitute a dream stream? Got a thumbs up from David. Thank you. And several of our people announced earlier, and a thumbs up from Jerry. Thank you so much. And even a heart from Abigail. Lovely.
Just sorry I wasn't here for the beginning of this one, but I couldn't work it out, so sorry.
That's quite all right. You're welcome on any basis at any time. Comments, questions, suggestions? I'm going to leave you with one final song before we transition to our VIP group, and that is, "It's so easy to dream of the days gone by, so hard to think of the times to come, and the grace to accept every moment as a gift is a gift that is given to some. What will we do with our days but work and hope? Let our dreams bind our work to our play. What can we do with each moment of our lives but love till we've loved it away? Love till we've loved it away. There are sorrows enough for the whole world's end. There are no guarantees but the grave. And the times we have spent and the moments we have shared are a treasure too precious to say. What will you do with your dreams but work and hope? Let your dreams bind your work to your play. What can you do with each moment of your life but love till you've loved it away? Love till you've loved it away."
Thank you, Paul.
Special thanks to all of you for sticking it out for 5 days. This has been a delight and a privilege for me to be able to share with you this week. And I trust that this is the beginning and not the end.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you,
Very
Paul.
helpful.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Paul.
More to come.
Thanks to everyone. I learned so much from everyone.
As did I. Thank you.
Yeah.
This has been a
Very
great
helpful.
week.
Good to see you all.
Yes, yes, you too.